Scholars debate when Romanticism actually hits the U.S. Many will point to the speeches and ideas flowing out of the American South in the even late colonial period. The Declaration of Independence has a certain romantic utopianism about it that was just a little different in character from the Enlightenment itself that Jefferson is so famous for. But as a strictly literary matter, aside from some devotional poetry of Phyllis Wheatley and Anne Bradstreet and stuff like that, American Romanticism comes as a celebration of Americana writ large, a sentimental approach towards literature and the American experiment in literature. And you get figures of great significance, quite frankly. Washington Irving writes The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. Charles Brockden Brown wrote Wyland. James Fenimore Cooper, The Leatherstocking Tales, Tales of Natty Bumppo, the Last of the Mohegans, The Pathfinder, the Pioneers, the Deerslayer, all these really great stories that prefigure the American Western even. And then, of course, Edgar Allan Poe and the fireside poets along with him. Very Gothic on the one hand, very sentimental on the other. All of these figures working very much within a kind of heavily European influenced mode of poetry. They were working within fairly well established models that had been set over in Germany and France and England. And they weren't necessarily breaking a lot of new ground with that, other than transplanting it to new soil. And scholars, can go crazy with the significance of that. But for the greatest development, let's say, of the Romantic movement in America, the high pure Romanticism needs to mix with the more brackish waters of realism in the mid-century, and that's when we get a period of flowering in literature that has come to be known as the American Renaissance, which is our cultural coming of age. And now this is a period in the middle decades of the 1800s where you see these giant figures coming about. Figures like Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and Walt Whitman. These giant figures were coming out with a new kind of literature that was very much American literature and didn't borrow so much or ape so much the European models. Now, a lot of this, and again, scholars will trace back to various sources and say, well, this was the first person who said, gee, maybe we should do our own thing or whatever. But a lot of this comes from Ralph Waldo Emerson himself, a speech he gave in 1837 to the Phi Beta Kappa Society at Harvard. He was always very much associated with Harvard, where he called for a new literature, a specifically American literature, one that gave a pass on the European influences and tried to discover an American voice, an American character, an American style in literature. The core of it has been isolated by one scholar named F.O. Matheson, Francis Otto. You can tell why he went with F.O., who in 1941 publishes this massive magnum opus study of American literature that focuses on 5 years. 1850, Ralph Waldo Emerson publishes Representative Men, one of his better essays, not his greatest, but it fits within the 5-year frame. Nathaniel Hawthorne comes out that same year with The Scarlet Letter. The following year, The House of the Seven Gables. In that same year, 1851, Herman Melville comes out with Moby Dick. 1854, Henry David Thoreau has Walden, and Walt Whitman comes out with his first edition of Leaves of Grass in 1855. Massive, massive, highly influential works of American literature, all in that tight little half decade. The importance of that is, in its way, epical. But of course, it doesn't take long to see that the limitations of that list are a little concerning, especially from our contemporary point of view. If you look at the core five people that Matheson points out, they're a little homogenous. They are pretty much all, well, they are all white men. They are all centered in the Northeast United States at the time. Emerson and Thoreau were very much Massachusetts boys. Hawthorne was from New England generally, Maine and Massachusetts. Melville was from New York, but spent some time in Massachusetts. And of course, Whitman was very much a New Yorker. But that's kind of limiting. And so other scholars have come along, other historians, and said, well, all right, let's reconsider this a little bit. Let's see how we can crack that open. Let's see what else we can come up with. And there it is a much more hotly debated field of study, let's say. Who qualifies as part of the American Renaissance? And you get a lot of really great figures, including those first five, but now also including people like William Wells Brown, the great African-American novelist, Harriet Beecher Stowe of Uncle Tom's Cabin fame, Emily Dickinson, who was writing in that general era. She didn't publish until later after her death, but she was active from a literary standpoint in those times. Frederick Douglass, for God's sakes, he was writing in that same period too, and he has had an enormous effect on American letters, on what language and writing and literature can do. And of course, yeah, let's put him in there. Edgar Allan Poe, who was a phenomenal writer and theorist of literature for his entire frustratingly short life, and other writers were able to take a lot of inspiration from him, and so he has some coattails, let's say. So this whole approach is probably a little bit more fair. And if you focus in on strictly Matheson's core four, you're really limiting yourself because it is just too simple and neat. Many scholars have come along and opened that up even more. My personal favorite would be David S. Reynolds, a great scholar of the CUNY system, who writes Beneath the American Renaissance, the Subversive Imagination in the Age of Emerson and Melville, where he does crack open the idea of that group and look at their inspirations, look at the popular culture that fed them, that maybe inspired them, that created conditions where their works could come about and thrive. And Reynolds read a lot of really cheesy and cheap dime novels of the age and came out with this great study of how the ground was fertilized, that these figures, these core five figures, did not just birth these masterpieces as if they were from the forehead of Zeus. They came about by craft. They came about by copying in many instances. They came about by having inspiration, not from above, but from below, from everybody around them. People who weren't perhaps as good an artist as they are. That's really bad grammar. I'm sorry for that. But how the culture itself creates its own masterpieces. That the masterpieces are not separate from the culture, and the culture envelops them in many different ways. And that's really where you have to start in approaching American literature, because it is a democratic literature. It is inspired by and aspiring to democratic principles. And that theme is very different and distinct from the European models, where monarchies, and especially in the 1800s, were still very much around and very much the norm. And democracy was really, really sketchy. And so you have to understand that. Now, this brings us back to the first point. You can't lean too hard into the political aspects of this. They are unavoidable to a degree, but you have to be very, very careful. Now, in Matheson, he did publish this in 1941, at a time when perhaps the United States and perhaps even the world was suddenly very anxious to see justification for U.S. world leadership. We were no longer at the kids' table of world affairs, and we were ready to take a leadership role. And so this was going to find some fertile ground in those early 40s. And that is part of this as well. The idea of going back and saying, okay, now that period is our Renaissance. And just think about what a huge cultural word Renaissance is. It's a little presumptuous, especially if you're just looking at 5 people over 5 years. And yeah, that is presumptuous. But as a framing ability to understand the culture, to look at a selection, because you can't read everything, not even Reynolds could. You have to look at a selection and say, okay, this is what that is. This is a good starting point for that. That said, be very careful. If you go and Google American Renaissance, you can go down some very dark alt-right rabbit holes. There's an awful lot of white supremacy that has seized on this title in just horrible, disgusting ways. And, that is unfortunate but unavoidable in a supposedly free society. So we're going to just move past that. What is important is to understand, I would think, the ideas of the American Renaissance, the idea that we as a nation were codifying our literature, or at least our literary credo, creating an identity for ourselves, regardless of the strict elements of its personnel and constitution. The idea of the American Renaissance has a broad and profound sociological significance, significance in culture as well. The Declaration of Independence for United States culture, as it has sometimes been called, I think Oliver Wendell Holmes called it that, was a big moment, I would say, in the history, whether we recognize it at the time or not. But it is something to be aware of as a way of approaching this material and seeing how even a narrow swath of figures were feeding off similar ideas and experimenting with them in very different ways. And as a whole, when you take all those different approaches to a similar project, you get what becomes a kind of national character, the character of America, as it was now asserting itself in the realm of world literature.